Jay Shear.
Jay Shear.
Jay Shear.
Jay Shear,
business consultant.
Jay Shear.
Jay Shear Business Consulting.
Hey, everybody. I'm Jay Shear with Jay Shear Business Consulting. We build solid foundations for service-based businesses to grow and scale and achieve the results and success they deserve. And you've joined Business Minds Coffee Chat. Warren Bennis said, "People who cannot invent and reinvent themselves must be content with borrowed postures, secondhand ideas, fitting in instead of standing out." Well, on today's episode, we talk about reinventing ourselves, standing out in a crowded space, accomplishing our big goals, rethinking failure, and more. Our guest is a consultant and keynote speaker who is a business professor at both Duke and Columbia University. She's been named one of the top 50 business thinkers in the world by Thinkers 50. She's a Wall Street Journal best-selling author of 4 books, and the New York Times has described her as an expert at self-reinvention and helping others make changes in their lives. Adding to this impressive resume, she's a Broadway investor, stand-up comedian, producer of a multiple Grammy-winning jazz album, is in the process of writing a Broadway musical, and was a former presidential candidate spokesperson. Please welcome the woman who is teaching us all to start playing the long game, Dorie Clark. Dorie, thank you so much for being here. It is great to see you.
Hey, Jay, I'm glad to be here. Thanks.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. I'm very much looking forward to jumping into this conversation. So let's kick it off. I'm curious, what words would you use to describe yourself today?
Well, in general, I would say my favorite word is friendly, because I try to just be friendly to people. I feel like it's a high value. I feel like there's not enough encouragement in the world, that there's a lot of times where people kind of get beaten down by things. So I try to be a force for encouraging others. Literally right this morning, I would say my word is tired, because I got up at 5:30 to do a 6 a.m. webinar with Dubai. So that is our global world that we live in these days. But it is a pleasure for me to be here talking with you.
Well, wonderful, as it is for me, and thank you. And I'm sure you provided tremendous value to those that were on the webinar from Dubai at such an early time for you. I think that's fantastic. So I understand that you wanted to be a spy growing up. So why don't you take us back a bit to where your story begins, and what were some of the early experiences that you had that shaped who you are today and the work that you're doing?
Well, I love your excavation, Jay. It's true. I was a big fan of James Bond when I was growing up. I thought it was the coolest thing ever. And of course, it's saying a lot because it was Roger Moore. But I loved all of it. I thought, just the international locales and fighting for good, and just being so incredibly suave. I loved all of it. And I think I do still aspire to all of those things. I realized that I would be a pretty bad spy in the scheme of things, because I'm a big fan of like transparency and openness. And so the idea of hiding my true identity seems very stressful to me. So I think in practice, it probably wouldn't be very good, but leading a debonair global lifestyle, that seems appealing. So I try to make that happen.
Well, that makes perfect sense. So let's continue to pull on that thread, though, about some of the areas of your background that really did help shape who you are today. So tell us a bit about your upbringing, some of the experiences that you had. You're known as a thinker. Were you a deep thinker in your youth?
I think I was probably pretty deep. I grew up as an only child, and and I had a lot of cats, and I really liked hanging out with my cats, but they were less good conversationalists. So I spent a lot of time by myself, and I spent a lot of time thinking. And so when I got to be 11, 12, 13, I was very interested in, I guess you could say, politics or socio-political or socio-cultural issues. I was really into the environment, and forced my family to start recycling, even though there was not easy recycling. You had to drive it to the special place, which in all honesty probably burned more fossil fuels driving there. But what can you do? But I'd wear little pins about the rainforest and things like that. So yeah, I tried to have a broader orientation, I guess.
So, what did you enjoy reading in those days? What type of books did you consume? What type of content were you looking at? What really was the driving interest for you then?
So when I was, I guess, a young teenager, a preteen, what actually caught my fancy was magazines. And in particular, there's a magazine, which I think still exists, albeit in maybe a slightly different form, called the Utne Reader. And the Utne Reader was kind of a funny concept, but it was very winning at the time, it was essentially a compendium of the best articles from other magazines. So you would subscribe to the Utne Reader, and they were kind of curators, and they would just like borrow and reprint articles from all these other magazines to make this like one powerhouse, super interesting magazine. So I subscribed to that, and then through that, I found out about a lot of other magazines that I was interested in, about music or culture or politics. And so I just had so many magazine subscriptions, but that was how I was kind of educating and informing myself at the time.
Interesting. I also had quite a few magazine subscriptions, but what I found was it was difficult to subscribe to so many. So I would go to the library and just look at the magazine rack and spend an inordinate amount of time there. So let's talk about politics for a moment. So I mentioned at the intro that you were a former presidential candidate spokesperson. How did you get involved in politics? What was the story behind that? And really, what did you learn from that experience about politics, and whether it was something that you would be interested in pursuing in the future?
Yeah, thank you, Jay. I'm curious, by the way, where did you grow up? You're in Florida now, right?
I am. I'm in Florida now. I actually grew up in Virginia, in the central part of the state, in Richmond.
Oh, nice. To answer your question about politics, I got, I think I honestly was just always interested in politics. It was something that was appealing to me for, I don't even know why, probably just genetic reasons. But when I was in third grade, I had a project where I decided, this was obviously not something my teachers made me do, but I decided that my project was I was going to draw portraits of all of the nation's presidents, which was like something like 40 at the time. And there was like an art show or an art competition, and I wanted to enter my collection of 40 presidents. And I was so mad because they were like, you can't enter 40, you have to pick your favorites. It was just like, but they're all my favorite. So that was a little bit traumatizing. But yeah, as I began to have more of a kind of burgeoning social consciousness, I guess, about things like the environment and the rainforests and all of that, I began to get interested in electoral politics as a vehicle for that. So there were a lot of different elements that clued me in. But what really, I guess, got me involved in a tactical sense was in 1997, or maybe 1996. I was dumbfounded that I was able to talk my way into this, but I had seen an ad in a newspaper that, sort of just like literally a classified ad, that an organization called the Gay and Lesbian Victory Fund, which was a political, like a PAC, political action committee to elect openly gay candidates, they were looking for board members. And so I reached out. I was, a college student at the time with apparently some chutzpah. And I was like, you know what you really need? You really need a college student on your board. That's the ticket. And, of course it completely isn't, because I had no money whatsoever. But I persuaded them. And so I was able to join the national board of this organization. And anyway, I served for a couple of years on the board, and I felt so massively guilty that I didn't have any money to give them, that what I started doing was volunteering for candidates that they had endorsed in my area. And so that got me having a lot of hands-on experience working on campaigns, which actually turned out to be useful because I was able to leverage that into jobs later on.
Interesting. So how did that political campaign go? And what were some of the lessons that you learned in being a spokesperson? And what was that experience like, if you're able to articulate that?
Yeah, well, so specifically for the presidential campaign that I worked on, I worked for Howard Dean during the 2004 cycle. And it was a really interesting ride because for people who followed it, they will recall Dean went from being just a complete unknown non-entity, governor of Vermont, 2% in the polls, basically, to becoming within the period of, let's call it 8 or 10 months, the front runner in the race, who was endorsed by Al Gore, who was, of course, the previous nominee. And on the cover of all these magazines, he was considered the presumptive front runner for probably a good month or two in the race, and then it all very suddenly collapsed. So we went from the highs to the lows and really got to see the arc of everything that politics can be. So it was an exciting experience in that regard, a little heartbreaking. But you learn an enormous amount. I think partly what you learn is endurance, which is why they often say that politics is a young person's game. You were literally working 7 days a week. Now we're all working 7 days a week, but this was in an office. You were literally going in, and we'd have an 8 a.m. meeting every weekday. It was a little more slack on weekends. We had a 9 a.m. meeting on weekends, and you'd be working for 10 to 12 hours in the office, just with no breaks. And I remember just this kind of miserable slog, and the only thing keeping you going was just the feeling, the knowledge that you were working on like literally the most important thing that was possibly happening in the world right then. You're doing God's work. So that gets you pretty far. But it was incredibly exhausting.
So through that process, as you look at what you've done since then, would you consider going back into politics at some point in some capacity?
I really have very little desire to do that. It is grueling, and I entered press relations because I had and really frankly do still have a huge amount of respect for the press. Compared to field organizers who had to deal with regular voters, many of whom, let's be honest, were not the best informed, and sometimes, very vociferous in their positions, including ill-informed ones. Journalists were some of the brightest people you'd meet. They loved politics. That's why they did this. They were passionate about it. They were knowledgeable. They were smart. They were insightful. They called it like they saw it. So I think sometimes to our detriment, press people sometimes view reporters as their adversary. And I didn't. I really respected them, and I respected their motivations for what they were doing. I think that one of the biggest problems, sometimes now we have the discourse about fake news and journalism is so terrible. The problem is not journalists. The problem is that journalists have had their ranks eviscerated. I started my career prior to entering politics as a journalist, and the numbers are absolutely stunning. Between 2000 and 2015, the number of American newsroom journalists declined by more than 40%. The problem is not the journalists that we have; it's the journalists we don't have because you needed more people to be able to keep their eyes on things and to maintain standards of objectivity. What you often saw is that in later years, non-journalists were being hired who had not been trained. They didn't understand the norms, and they were being brought in from, sort of as lifestyle bloggers who are chasing clicks. But for serious, well-trained journalists, I mean, that's one of the highest callings out there. So I always had a lot of respect for that. But anyway, to answer your original question of what I want to be in politics, what I have decided I do believe in, and I'm very interested in public service, but my goal now is that in, let's call it a 20-year goal, I would like to be named a US ambassador somewhere. That is, of course, an appointed position, not an elected position. And it's one that I think I could probably do pretty well with my press training. You have to be a little bit smart about what you say. So I think I could mostly do that. But yes, running for office seems like a rather desultory task, I'm afraid.
Fair enough. So in terms of being a U.S. ambassador, have you looked at a particular area of the world that would be of interest to you?
I think mostly one does not have a huge amount of control over that. So, I mean, sometimes it's just random. I mean, Caroline Kennedy going to Japan, maybe there's some amazing reason for that. Not that I'm aware of, but, sure, why not? So I think it's about your overall relationship with the candidate, whoever that ends up being, and, frankly, your ability to raise money for them. So those are things that I'll have to be thoughtful about in the coming decades.
Very good. Well, we look forward to finding out where you're going to become that U.S. ambassador, and we'll certainly check back in and between now and up to 20 years. It's just knowing you and what you've been able to accomplish. When you set your mind to something, it seems like you have a tendency to make it happen.
I appreciate it, Jay. Thank you. Yes, in the interest of my mom, I'll say that the key metric is somewhere not dangerous.
Ooh, that'll be an interesting one. We'll see what happens there. So let's talk about COVID for a moment. How has COVID influenced or changed your thinking?
Yeah, that is a great question. Certainly, from a business perspective, like a lot of people in early 2000, I freaked out. I thought there was a not insignificant chance that the entire world economy would just freeze up. And so I remember thinking in March or April, gosh, it is not unlikely that I am going to earn zero for the rest of this year, because just everything was being canceled in droves. Nobody was traveling, nobody was doing anything. But of course, we managed to adapt pretty quickly. We managed to adapt to doing things virtually that we had never done virtually before. And I kind of went crazy with monetization, because I thought that because it was extremely unclear what the economic prospects were, I was basically like, okay, I need to take all of the ways that I could conceivably earn money now and just do them all right now. So I created, something ridiculous, like, 4 online courses in, a period of a few months. I did a launch of my own online course, Recognized Expert. I signed a book contract, wrote a first draft of my book, all of these things. And it was very intense. And as a result, I think actually something that was productive was I realized that I had been pushing myself too hard, and I needed to put in place some structure and some boundaries to be able to protect, sort of protect the asset, which is me. So I began last September of 2020, taking Fridays off. So that is something that, I voluntarily bent some rules around my book launch, because, that was a period of time where I really had to be heads down and focused. But in general, for the better part of, a year plus now, I've taken these Fridays off, which has been really wonderful, and have used that as a way of restoring a little bit of balance in my life. But I think more than anything, COVID has shown me that we need to be conscious about balancing our portfolio over time. And it doesn't, we may not have balance within a given period of time, because frankly, time is arbitrary anyway. It's just sometimes we have to really focus on things and grind. But it's not a problem to grind, but the problem is grinding all the time. So I think I've become more aware of that. What would you say your big COVID lessons are, Jay?
First of all, the podcast actually was launched right at the beginning of COVID, and it actually came out of something else that I was doing where I would bring business leaders together to basically mastermind, roundtable, talk about pain points, challenges in their business, and create a networking environment, but really create an environment where everyone that attended these meetings would walk away with something tangible or actionable that they could apply in their personal and professional lives. And when COVID hit and we could no longer do that, I was looking for a way to continue to serve. And that's where the podcast was truly birthed. And it's really helped me focus on priorities and what's truly important in life. So there were, and we're going to talk about this in a few minutes, but there were so many things that I was saying yes to, and I wasn't creating the space, that white space for myself. And I found that just was not a sustainable option for me or an option for my business. So there were definitely and have been some very, very valuable lessons that have been learned, and the lessons continue, which I'm very grateful for. So we were talking about obviously COVID and how that's influenced or changed your thinking, which you shared some nuggets with us on that. And so you created an online course for LinkedIn on strategic thinking. And I believe you created that a few years ago. And I just looked recently, and that course has been viewed by more than 1.3 million learners. So we can all agree that strategic thinking is important, but why do so few of us actually make time for it and apply it in our personal and professional lives?
Yeah, this is such an important question, Jay. And as a matter of fact, I actually recently gave a TEDx talk talking specifically about this question. I think it'll be posted hopefully relatively soon. But there's two answers, right? There's the obvious answer, which is we all have too much email, we all have too many meetings. We know this, and it is not wrong. But there's also other answers, what I call the sort of more subconscious or subliminal answers. And those are a little harder because we don't necessarily recognize them or acknowledge them. And those would be things like the fact that staying constantly busy is actually, at least in American culture, a form of status. There's been a lot of really great research by Sylvia Bellezza at Columbia talking about this fact, and the fact that, oftentimes really it's like a form of humble bragging, like, oh, hey, how are you? Oh, so busy, and it's basically saying like, I'm so important. And that can be a hard thing to give up. And also, there are a lot of things in contemporary life where we just don't know the answer. Like, maybe we haven't done something before, or maybe, there's not an answer to know. It's just like, I don't know. And under those circumstances, staying busy, kind of keeping heads down, is often a sort of emotionally safer choice than actually leaning into the question of, gosh, am I doing the most important thing? What should I be doing? Is this the right field? Is this the right job? That can be a really provoking question. And sometimes it's a lot easier to just keep doing the thing that we're already doing, even if it's a little bit suboptimal.
So was that course part of the catalyst for writing The Long Game?
It actually was, in the sense that it certainly demonstrated the viability of strategic thinking and long-term thinking as an area that people were interested in. I had no idea that many people would dive into it or feel the need to embrace strategic thinking, but it showed me that there was a hunger for that topic. And in particular, as I started to think about it, or as I started to research it more, I began to realize that the biggest problem, to your point, is that everybody thinks that strategic thinking is a good idea. I mean, there's pretty much no one that's like, oh yeah, that's terrible. They all think it's good, but they just don't do it. And I wanted to begin to dive into that and explore it, and hopefully begin to give people tools to solve it, to close that gap.
Well, you have definitely done that. So I want to delve into the long game, and obviously we're going to provide a link where everyone can purchase this book. So the book itself, it's broken down into three key sections. So you have white space, focus where it counts, and keeping the faith. And I'd like to delve into each one and kind of cover some of the key areas. But before we do that, would you compare and contrast short and long-term thinking for us?
Sure. Well, the way that I define long-term thinking is, sometimes people ask, like, well, what is long-term? Like, how long is long-term? And I like to say it's not necessarily that there's a number I put on it per se, but it actually is a mentality about being willing to sacrifice or being willing to make smarter choices today. And so my quick definition of long-term thinking is being willing to do something today that will make things easier or better tomorrow. And, we can define tomorrow however far out. Whereas short-term thinking, if we're looking at the opposite, I think is much more about, okay, I'm going to do the thing that's optimal today, and I'm going to do it irrespective of long-term consequences. Thus the Cheetos or whatever.
Very good. Let's go ahead and dig into the first section when it comes to white space. And we talked a little bit about this earlier in the conversation, but I love the opening line that you have in the section on white space, where you say you can't pour more liquid into a glass that's already full. And as I shared with you, I've definitely experienced that before, where I just said yes to everything and took on everything I possibly could, and where that ultimately leads. So let's talk about that. And what is the real reason that we're all so busy?
Well, we've talked about some of them in terms of the status and things like that. But, ultimately there's a lot of problems that we have to address and peel back. One of the biggest ones is that it is very hard, sometimes painful, for people to say no. And the truth is, we are bombarded with people asking us for things these days. I mean, just the fact that people can email us, there's no cost to it. I can send you, 10 emails for free asking for a million different things. And in fact, I actually, a couple of years ago, did a little experiment where for a couple of weeks I tracked exactly what the content was. I did sort of a chart of all of the emails that I received so that I can understand what it was that was actually coming at me, and why it was so stressful. And what I discovered was that I was getting about 70 requests a week, or, on average about 10 requests per day, of people asking me for things. Can you do this favor? Can you do this thing for me? And you feel kind of like a bad person, just saying no, 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 but you're forced to say no, 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 unless, if you want to protect your boundaries. So it's a real challenge, and you actually have to develop strategies around this. So I've thought about it a lot, about ways that we can begin to get smarter about it. One of the things, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I wanted to make sure we were going to go there, because I want to talk about a framework that we can all use, that we can share with the audience, for what to say yes to and what we should say no to.
Yeah, exactly. Well, one super low hanging fruit that I recommend, and I certainly try to practice in my own life, is I used to have the rather naive interpretation or view that other people had the same sensibility around time or the importance of time as I did. And I came to realize, like, no, 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 they don't. Some people, they want to have a meeting for everything. Like, that's their go-to. Like, oh, let's have a meeting. Like, they feel like, oh, they must have all the time in the world. These are pretty unproductive people, and we cannot let them drag us down. So we often, I'm pretty sure, I'm speaking for me, but probably for you too, Jay, we often will get messages like, oh, hey, there's a thing I want to talk to you about. When are you next free for a half an hour? And, I used to assume like, oh gosh, I guess it's, some important thing that must be worth a half an hour. Not necessarily. They think it is. That doesn't mean it's worth it to me. So I never, at this point, never let someone get away with a lack of specificity. I always write back and say, oh, hey, I'd love to help if I can. Tell me more about what you want to talk about. And as a standard operating procedure, I make them specify so that I then am actually properly able to make an informed decision about whether it's worth my time or not.
That's perfect. So when you do that, just out of curiosity, will you typically get a response back with something very specific?
Yeah, I mean, the truth is, if somebody does want to kind of pull a fast one on you, they might actually just beg off at that point because they don't really want their ruse to be revealed. Oh, I want to sell you my multi-level marketing scheme, or whatever. But in a lot of cases, people will get back to you. And, I had a guy recently, a lovely guy, it was not that he was meaning to be obfuscatory in this instance, but he gave me the sort of super quick like, hey, when can we talk? And so I made him specify like, okay, what is it? And he went on to say, oh, well, there's this program that I want to do next year and I think he'd be great for it, and I don't really have it fleshed out. I thought we could maybe co-create it. And it's a great offer, but I'm like, oh my God, that sounds like way too much work. Like, I don't have the bandwidth for that in my life. And so I just wrote back, I'm like, thank you so much. I'm honored you thought of me, but like, I got too many things going on to be like ideating a program. But thank you. And I don't know if he felt like I was doing him a favor, but I was certainly doing myself a favor by saving the half an hour. And frankly, I was doing him a favor because do you really want to spend 30 minutes giving a spiel to somebody who's like, no? So hopefully it enables him to move on to somebody who actually would be better for it.
Yeah, perfect. What a great way to respond. So what have you said no to that you later realized you should have said yes to?
That's a great point and a great question. I'm trying to think about, if there's any sort of things that I regret. And the truth is not really. The good news is I'm not so much of a FOMO person. I am pretty good at like, once I close a door, I close a door, and I just treat it like, all right, well, that wasn't possible. That was, that's not a thing anymore. And so I try not to dwell on it. So it's possible that there's things that like, damn, I really should have done X, Y, Z, but I don't necessarily feel too bad about, well, okay, I'll give you one example. So there's a thing that LinkedIn has now called LinkedIn newsletters. You can do newsletters on LinkedIn and they go straight to a mailbox. And originally there was the way that it was rolled out was, like a lot of things that they do, they roll it out in sort of a limited pilot test. And only later do they make it accessible to everybody. Mm-hmm. And so originally they had an idea, which they called a LinkedIn series. And it was intended, as they were originally conceiving of it, as like a series of articles or something. They're like, do a series. And I did have the opportunity. I'm not sure that it was explicitly offered to me, but it was, somebody said like, oh, if you want this, you can reach out, so it would have been possible for you to do a series. And I didn't see the logic in it. I'm like, a series of articles, like what, why, like I didn't sort of get it. And the truth was, I mean, obviously they pivoted, they iterated. It wasn't the best idea. A newsletter was a better idea. But the people who participated in that early pilot, they gave extra, like, I think, algorithmic love to. And so some of these people were able to amass, once they switched it to a newsletter, they already had like followers for their series, and they were, suggesting it to people. So I have friends who got in early and they have like 200,000 subscribers to their newsletter, which is fantastic. The minute they switched it to a newsletter, I'm like, oh, that makes sense. And so I started doing it. But now I have, probably, I don't know, just shy of 30,000 subscribers. That's great. 200,000 would be nicer. I did not get on the bandwagon early enough. Now, do I feel really bad about it? No, because it was one more thing where I didn't see the value of it. And I guess if I had been really perspicacious, I could have been like, oh, but what it could evolve into is XYZ. But it wasn't there yet. And you place some bets and some work out and some don't.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for sharing the one instance and what the outcome was. I think we can all relate and can look back. But I think to your point, though, it's not about regret. It's about learning from those past experiences. And is there something different that I should have thought more deeply about now that I look back on it, because I have perspective and can look at it through different optics, that I can now carry forward and use in my decision-making process today. So that's a good example. So let's jump into section 2 here. This is around focusing where it counts. And I'd love to talk about setting the right goals and thinking in waves. So let's talk about the right goals.
Yes. So setting the right goals, of course, we can all sort of nod and say, yes, that does sound like a good idea, doesn't it? But it's harder than we might imagine sometimes, because we often get caught up in society's views of what the right goals are. I mean, it's really easy for a lot of us to just kind of go on autopilot in terms of the path that's been laid for us by culture, by society, by our family, whoever, not out of malice, but because, they really think they're being helpful. Like, no, these are the right goals. But the problem emerges when sometimes it's not quite the right thing for you. And so I think that for me, one of the highest values is about, frankly, staying interested, staying engaged. I'm somebody that has a lot of interests, and I like to keep it lively. And I think there's a lot of people like that. And so I have a concept that I talk about in the book called optimize for interesting, because I think that there's so much emphasis sometimes culturally on the idea of, sort of leaning into your passion and finding your passion and things like that, which is great. But a lot of people don't necessarily know what that is. It's just like either you love too many things, or you're just like, I don't know, I've been working a lot. Like, I don't know what my passion is. And it can feel really stymieing and frustrating. Like, oh God, I just can't do anything. I can't make any moves. I can't make any decisions until I know what my passion is. Which of course is the worst thinking, because you can't think your way into discovering what you really love to do. So I like to just lower the bar collectively and say, you know what, who cares? Whatever your passion is, what's interesting? Give me something that's interesting. And everybody can answer that question. And it at least gives you something to start with, something that you can move toward. And if it keeps being interesting, then great, keep doing it. If it doesn't, then you can switch, and, no stress, low bar. And that's how we can learn.
Love it. So how about thinking in waves?
So thinking in waves is my concept around just understanding at a really fundamental level that where we often get in trouble professionally is trying to keep doing the same thing over and over again. And then being frustrated, like, oh my God, I'm in a rut. Well, yeah, because you're doing the same thing over and over again. We need to switch the waves that we're in. We need to become smart and thoughtful enough to realize that there are different times that call for different actions and different activities. And so the 4 that I've identified are learning, creating, connecting, and reaping. Sort of we go from figuring things out to adding value of our own, to connecting with other people who can amplify what we're doing or sharpen what we're doing, and then actually getting to enjoy the fruits of our success, all of which is amazing. And then, of course, just the realization that this is not the end point. It's a circle, and we have to keep learning. We can't just sit and like milk the cow for 40 years. We gotta learn something new as well. That's how I like to think about that. Do you feel like there's been sort of waves in your career, Jay? How has that worked for you?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's been things that I've tried that seemed like they were interesting, And, I would try them and I would learn from those experiences. The challenge that I faced, I don't face it quite as much today, but I didn't know when to cut bait. So sometimes I would stay in something too long because I was heads down, right? I was just always focused on the doing, executing, looking, waiting for the right outcomes. And if I keep going, right, I'm going to get there. And I went past the point of this is interesting. So that was a valuable lesson learned. So yes, I have definitely experienced that before, but I totally agree with you. I mean, there's those different seasons that we go through with projects that we work on, things that we're interested in. And I love your concept of lowering the bar a bit. Let's try some things, because so many people, again, to your point, they don't know what their passion is or what their why and their purpose is, right? They're trying to figure it out. Well, I think one of the best ways that you can do that is to keep trying things that are interesting to you. And when you hit on it, I think you'll know it if you're paying attention.
Yeah, so right.
Excellent. So one other thing in section 2 that I would be remiss if we didn't at least touch on, and that's the right people, the right rooms. And I look at the stories that you tell in the book and how important connections, networking, building your network, how important that has been to your career and obviously many of us. So touch on that for a moment.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, one of the things that we all are probably aware of is there's a lot of people out there that have a very bad impression of networking. You'll often hear people, unlike strategic thinking, where there's not like an anti-strategic thinking constituency, there's definitely an anti-networking constituency where people say, I hate networking. Why do I have to do this? This is terrible. And I feel kind of sad about that, because the truth is what they are focusing in on is only one variation of networking. And frankly, it's the bad variation. It's short-term networking where somebody, is sort of maniacally focused on extracting something from you as quickly as possible. And of course, nobody likes that. But really, to me, networking is about making friends. It's about how you make friends as an adult. And I think, hopefully people are reasonably interested in that. But, I've never believed in the thinking around like, don't do business with your friends. Like, I only want to do business with my friends. I want to do business with people that I love, that it's fun to be with. If you really respect somebody, if you really think that they're somebody who has integrity, of course, you want to do business with them all day long. And so for me, making friends and forming professional relationships is really of a piece.
Beautifully said. And I'm sure we've all experienced those situations where we are in some sort of networking event, and you've got those that bring a stack of cards, and all they're doing is just handing out cards left and right. And if I hand out enough cards, I'm going to get a certain number of phone calls. That may be the logic, but you've not developed any type of rapport. You don't know what someone's issues are, what their needs are, but you're automatically pushing your product or service on someone. And we experience this on social media as well, where we connect with somebody, perhaps it's on LinkedIn, and after making a connection within 2 minutes, you're getting pitched on something. Well, you don't know me. You don't know what my needs are. You don't know what my pain points are. So it's an interesting situation. So let's go over to section 3 and keeping the faith, and let's talk there about strategic patience and rethinking failure for a moment.
Yeah, certainly. So strategic patience is my sort of formulation, because obviously a key piece of playing the long game, I mean, it is understanding that, like, okay, it can be long. It can be longer than we want. It often is longer than we want, which is frustrating. But I feel like just saying like, oh, just be patient is awfully inadequate in this situation, because to me, just be patient is often about just like people telling you, sit back, don't do anything, be passive, just like suck it up, basically. And I hate that. So strategic patience for me is basically being able to hold two realities at the same time. One is it probably, can or will take a while. And that is annoying, but that is also true. And so if we want to live in reality, we should acknowledge that. But also, that doesn't mean there's nothing you can do. That doesn't mean like, oh, just like twiddle your thumbs and wait for life to happen to you. It means there's things you can do. You can create hypotheses. You can test those hypotheses. You can get, you can build your network. You can train. You can do things. And who knows, maybe that might hasten the process. Maybe it doesn't. But they're valuable things to do nonetheless. And so it's a kind of more active and muscular form of patience.
Perfect. And then how about rethinking failure?
So rethinking failure is a piece that I talk about in the long game as well, because at a really fundamental level, one of the things that quite logically, of course, holds us back is that if we are attempting some big goal, some important thing, it feels high stakes to us. It's something that matters, and you don't want to fail at that. That is not a nice feeling. But also, if we are going to accomplish things that we've never accomplished before, there is some degree of uncertainty. Of course, you don't know exactly how to do it. You haven't done it before. That is only logical. And so the way that I like to think about it is, how can we defang failure? And for me, the best way to do it is to lower the stakes, because, I think about casinos, and if you lose $1 million at a casino, Jay, people might say, yeah, he failed. If you lose $1 at a casino, no one's going to say that you failed. They're going to say, oh, well, he had fun, like, who cares? And it's not even worth calling it failure. It's like the wrong term because it's so small. And I think that if we can actually just make smaller bets and really essentially apply the lean startup methodology to our careers and say, what is the smallest possible bet that I can place so that I can see if this is a good idea? So if I can see if I like it, if I'm good at it, if people seem interested in this as a thing or as a service, if we can test those things at very low cost, if it doesn't work, I mean, honestly, who cares? You feel bad if you waste a year of your life. You don't feel bad if you waste an hour of your life. You're like, all right, I learned something. And I think that's how we've got to think about it.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing. So as we move toward the close of our conversation, what challenge would you like to leave our audience with?
Well, one thing that comes to my mind, Jay, which I did personally myself this year, I'm teaching at Duke this week. That's the bad conference lighting. And on the plane ride down to Duke, I actually did a calendar review to really look at my calendar for 2021 and see how I was allocating my time and whether that was in alignment with what I said or what I wanted, or just almost to do a kind of excavation, a forensic excavation, to understand what was going on there, what are patterns that I picked up on. And I invite people to do that and to really look at, okay, where are you spending your time? What are the things that are disproportionately enjoyable or disproportionately not enjoyable? What are changes that you would like to make moving forward? And it enables you to in a thoughtful way, really spot challenges or problems. And so, one thing that I'm going to adopt moving forward, and, admittedly, I was pushing hard because of my book launch. The good news is I'm not going to write another book for several years. So there's just no reason. There's literally no reason why I have to do this. And so therefore I won't. I'm implementing a policy that I am not going to permit more than 5 scheduled meetings in a day. I looked at my calendar this year, especially around my book launch, and I would literally sometimes have 9 to 10 meetings that were scheduled. And, of course I felt stressed. Of course, there was not even room to go to the bathroom or to eat anything because of these back-to-back meetings. I know, will I probably have more than 5 meetings? Probably, but there's always things that come up last minute. There's always somebody like, can I talk to you about blah, blah, blah? And I want to have room in my schedule to permit that to happen so that it doesn't back up and create a situation. And you need to have that white space. And part of how I can do it is to make sure that I am not in advance scheduling any more than 5 things in a day.
Perfect. So for all of you that are watching and listening right now, make sure that you hear those words. I think it's a great idea to take a look at your own calendar and look at how you're using your time, what makes the most sense, where you're going to get the greatest return, and make sure you're adding white space, right? So before I ask my final question to you, share with us where we can go to connect, to consume your content. And also you have an assessment. So please share where we can access the assessment as well.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jay. So, of course, the new book is The Long Game: How to Be a Long-Term Thinker in a Short-Term World. And if folks want to learn more about me, or especially these principles of strategic thinking and how to apply them to their life and career, the best place to go is there's a free strategic thinking self-assessment, as you mentioned, and folks can get it at dorieclark.com/thelonggame.
Perfect. Well, we will certainly link to that in the show notes, along with all of your social channels. So here is my final question to you. As you think about your contributions to this world, all the things that you've done up to this point, how will you measure your life?
Yes, this is a wonderful question. And of course, I'm a big fan of the eponymous book by Clay Christensen and my friend Karen Dillon. And as we think about measuring your life, I think there's always a couple of strands. One is your sort of professional contribution. And in my case, I think the things that I would point to that I'm proudest of are my books, because it's really a sort of lasting codification of some of my ideas. And hopefully it will be over time able to help people and travel beyond just folks who interact with me one-on-one. And then, of course, there's your relationships with the people that you care about. And so, in fact, one thing that I'm doing literally right now, as soon as we get off, my mom is picking me up. She lives in North Carolina, and so I could have rushed back home to New York, but instead I'm spending three extra nights because she really wanted me at her house, and so I am going back to Mama's house and spending a few nights there. I'm going to go to a cocktail party at her friend's house tonight, and getting to have quality time there. So it's really important for me to be a good daughter and to make sure that I am allocating time to the people in my life that I care about. So I definitely try to prioritize that as well.
I love that. Sounds like you're going to have a very nice time tonight at the cocktail party. I'm assuming your mother's going to certainly show how proud she is of you and what you're doing and how you're contributing to this world. I think that's a beautiful thing. So, Dorie, thank you so much for spending time with us today on Business Minds Coffee Chat, for sharing of your experience and your knowledge, your backstory, bringing your books to life and helping us as listeners be able to lead more fulfilling and more empowering lives. So I'm grateful for you. Thank you.
Jay, thank you. What a treat to speak with you. I appreciate it.
Thank you. And for all of you, thank you so much for watching and listening. And please take a moment to subscribe, rate, and leave us a review. We would love it if you would share one or two key takeaways from this particular episode. And to enjoy more episodes and to learn how Jay Shear Business Consulting can build a solid foundation for your service-based business, all you have to do is visit jayshearbusinessconsulting.com. And until next time, keep learning and growing. Make sure you pick up a copy of The Long Game and apply the lessons learned. And we'll see you on the next Business Minds Coffee Chat. Take care.
Jay Shear.
Jay Shear.
Jay Shear.
Jay Shear.
Business Consultant. Jay Shear. Jay Shear Business Consulting.